This is part 2 on how rent-stabilized apartments become deregulated in New York City. In part 1, I talked about how the number one reason that apartments become deregulated in New York City is because of something called high rent vacancy. Prior to 2019, when a tenant vacated a rent-stabilized apartment, the landlord would get an opportunity to renovate and increase the rent. If through the allowable increases, the rent surpassed the high rent threshold, then the apartment would automatically become deregulated. As a renter, it's your job to request your rental history from DHCR, the link is in our bio, and figure out if there are any red flags or discrepancies on your history. I'm going to show you an example of a DHCR rental history where the apartment was deregulated because of high rent vacancy. We are looking at a rental history of an Upper West Side apartment that was deregulated in 2007. You can see here that the landlord registered the legal rent at around $1,600 in 2006. The high rent threshold in 2006 was $2,000. So if the rent surpassed $2,000 a month, it would automatically become deregulated. So according to the history, this tenant vacated the apartment in 2007. This vacancy gave the landlord an opportunity to increase the rent. They could increase the rent in a few different ways. One, by renovating or doing some improvements to the apartment, increasing the rent using a vacancy bonus, which was something that landlords could do at this time, and just increasing the rent normally according to the RGB guidelines. Usually that increase was anywhere between 0 to 10%. So it is plausible, taking into consideration all of those allowable increases, that the landlord could get the rent from $1,600 to over $2,000 a month to warrant this high rent vacancy exemption. Now, this is the tricky part. The landlord didn't register any of the apartment improvements on the history. So it's difficult for renters to determine if these renovations were actually done. This requires a little bit of detective work. You want to look around your apartment and see, oh, is there any improvements here? Do I have a new fridge? Do I have a new stove? What's going on? Now, if you see a history like this and you suspect that the landlord did not renovate or did not invest money into the apartment, you can challenge the history. You would have to file a complaint with DHCR and they would investigate. The landlord has to keep records of everything that they've ever done to that apartment, and they will have to prove to DHCR how much they spent and what work was done. Personally, I would not challenge this rental history in particular because the $1,600 is already so close to the $2,000 threshold. So even with just the allowable increases from RGB and a vacancy bonus without any renovations, they still get very close to that $2,000 mark. Where you should really be suspicious is where you see huge jumps in rent from $300 to $2,000 or $600 to $2,500. Those types of jumps would require the landlord to have invested tens of thousands of dollars into an apartment. So if you're looking around the apartment and you're like, still looks pretty like old and dungy to me, that's when you want to investigate. If you're looking at your rental history and you are still so confused, be sure to upload it to our rent stabilization map. The link is in our bio. Our team will take a look at it and let you know what we think. Drop your questions in the comments and be sure to give us a follow for more tips and info on renting in New York City.